For more than 200 years, the perfect fried egg in Appalachia came down to 5 things, 5 techniques passed down through generations of mountain families. Not because they were fancy, not because they required expensive equipment, but because they worked. And they'd worked for over 200 years. The Appalachian region stretches across 13 states, from southern New York all the way down to northern Mississippi, and the food that came out of these mountains was shaped by a collision of cultures unlike almost anywhere else in America. Native American Cherokee traditions met Scotch-Irish settlers, German immigrants, Italian families, and African American communities. Each group brought something to the table, literally, and what emerged was a cuisine built on necessity, resourcefulness, and a deep respect for simple ingredients done right. The signature dishes that define this tradition: cornbread, baked in a cast iron skillet, soup beans simmered low and slow, wild ramps foraged from the hillsides in spring, and sorghum molasses drizzled over a hot biscuit, aren't just foods. They're the fingerprints of a people who learned to cook with what the land gave them. In the first United States Census back in 1790, 75% of the people settled in the southern Appalachian Mountains were of Celtic descent. Peter Koch, an education associate at the Mountain Heritage Center at Western Carolina University, has pointed out that these Scotch-Irish settlers had to completely reinvent their diets. They went from living on dairy, potatoes, barley, and rye to building a food culture around corn, wheat, and pork. That transition, that adaptation, is where so much Appalachian cooking genius was born. But to understand any of this, you have to understand one thing first: the skillet. In most Appalachian homes, through the 1800s and well into the 1900s, the kitchen was not full of specialty equipment. There was no drawer of different pans for different purposes. There was the cast iron skillet, maybe a pot, maybe a Dutch oven if the family was well off, and everything came out of that one pan. Cornbread, fried chicken, beans, eggs, game meat, gravy, all of it. When a woman passed away, her skillet was the thing her daughters fought over, because they knew what it was worth, not in dollars, but in meals, in memories, in seasoning that took a lifetime to build. So with that foundation, here are the 5 things those kitchens understood. The first was bacon grease, not butter, not oil. In Appalachian kitchens, no carnivorous household was complete without a receptacle for storing and straining what they called liquid gold. Bacon grease, rendered bacon fat, whatever you want to call it, was the cooking medium of choice, and eggs were one of the first foods that benefited from it. The fat carries the same flavor, salt, and smokiness as the bacon itself, and it creates a perfect cooking surface. What surprises most people is that an egg fried in bacon grease isn't overwhelmed with bacon flavor. It's more subtle than you'd expect, a gentle smokiness and savory depth that elevates the egg without competing with it. And critically, bacon grease keeps the eggs from sticking to the pan. There was one rule those cooks never broke though. Leftover grease from scorched bacon never went near the eggs. Burnt fat turns bitter, and that bitterness doesn't dilute, it only ruins the egg. Down south, the Appalachian bacon grease method produces what some people call a dirty fried egg. The whites get brown spots from the hot rendered fat. It's not pretty by Instagram standards, but the flavor is extraordinary. The second was heat, and patience with it. This is where most people go wrong, even experienced cooks. An egg, or even the fat, dropped into a cast iron skillet before it's had time to come up to temperature, will stick every time. The mountain cooks knew the fix was patience. The pan went over medium-low heat for a full 5 minutes before anything touched it, because cast iron doesn't heat evenly the way people assume. It needs the time to bring the whole surface up to temperature. Only once the pan was hot did the fat go in. With butter, the signal was the melt, then the sizzle, then the first hint of browning around the edges, and the eggs went in right at that moment. And here's the counterintuitive part. The heat often came down after the eggs hit the pan. Cast iron retains heat beautifully, drawing more warmth from the burner while staying hot enough to cook the eggs perfectly, and that slightly lower temperature is what kept them from sticking. A well-seasoned cast iron skillet, a Lodge, if you want the Tennessee-made heritage brand that's been producing them since 1896, or whatever piece a grandmother left behind, cooks eggs just as effectively as any non-stick pan. without the coatings, the chemicals, or the short shelf life. It also sidesteps the PFAS, the so-called forever chemicals found in PTF E-coated non-stick cookware that more and more people are working to eliminate from their kitchens. Several states are actively moving to ban PFAS in cookware through 2025 and beyond, and cast iron avoids that concern entirely. The third was basting, and never flipping. This one goes back generations. There's a 72-year-old man who shared a memory of staying at his grandparents' house in the 1950s. His grandmother would yell up the stairs that breakfast was ready, and when he came down, she'd be at the stove spooning hot fat over the eggs until the yolk was just barely covered in white. Then she'd plate it, make a slight cut in the soft yolk, and place a pat of butter inside. That's the traditional basted egg, a technique with a long history in American regional cooking. Hot fat spooned over the top to cook the surface without ever flipping. But there was a variation that worked even better in most home kitchens. The steam method. Once the egg was in the pan and the whites had begun to set on the bottom, a small splash of water went in around the outside edge, and the lid went on immediately. The water turned to steam, and the steam cooked the top of the egg gently and evenly. The timing told the whole story. A minute and a half under the lid gave a sunny side-up egg. Closer to 2.5 minutes produced over easy. For over medium, the lid came off at 2.5 minutes. The egg got a single flip, and another 30 seconds uncovered finished it. The result was solid whites and soft, creamy yolks, every single time. The fourth was freshness. Americans eat roughly 279 eggs per person per year, but most of those eggs have been washed with detergents during processing, which strips away the egg's natural protective coating, called the bloom. Between processing, storage, and transportation, store-bought eggs can be several weeks old by the time they reach the refrigerator. Fresh eggs hold their shape better. The yolk sits higher, the whites are stiffer and cling together instead of spreading thin across the pan, and farm-fresh yolks tend to be deeper in color, creamier in texture, and less likely to break during cooking. The difference shows up most in simple preparations, where the egg is the star: scrambled, fried, poached. There's nowhere to hide. In fairness, blind taste tests have sometimes shown that people can't reliably distinguish farm fresh from store-bought by flavor alone. But the cooking performance difference is real and visible. For a perfectly shaped fried egg, freshness mattered. The fifth, and possibly the simplest, was temperature. When a cold egg went straight from the icebox into a hot pan, two things happened. The egg took longer to cook, which meant more time for things to go wrong, and the temperature shock caused uneven cooking, where the edges overcooked before the center was done. Cold food also tends to stick to hot surfaces more readily. The solution took zero skill. The eggs came out of the cold and sat on the counter for 30 to 60 minutes before they ever met the pan, coming up gradually to room temperature. That was it. It minimized the thermal shock and produced consistently better results. Appalachian food had been sustainable, organic, and farm-to-table for generations, long before any of those became marketing buzzwords. These 5 things weren't innovations, they were inheritances. They came from people who couldn't afford to waste a single egg, who cooked 3 meals a day in the same cast iron skillet, and who understood through sheer repetition what worked and what didn't. The mountains didn't produce celebrity chefs. They produced grandmothers who could make something extraordinary out of almost nothing. A pan of bacon grease, a dozen fresh eggs, a handful of ramps pulled from the creek bank, and cornbread left over from the night before. And if you listen to what they knew, your breakfast will never be the same.